Welcome to the Investopoly podcast. Our goal is to share easy to understand, evidence based, holistic insights to help you master the game of building wealth. My name's Campbell Wallace. I'll be subbing in for Stuart today. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is rentvesting. Now, rentvesting is a strategy of wealth creation that's become a lot more popular in recent times. I've seen a lot of financial influencers or financial commentators on social media really advocating for rentvesting as a wealth creation strategy. So I really wanted to put it to the test today. And what I might start by doing is first just defining what rent vesting is for those that don't know. Really, my definition of rent vesting is it's pretty much renting where you live and investing in property elsewhere. And so it's a alternative strategy to the traditional home ownership, which basically you buy your home and you live in it. This strategy involves renting where you live and buying an investment property. And rent vesting could technically extend to not investing in property. It could be investing in other assets like shares, for example. But I think typically the most common definition of it is investing in property. And I think it's becoming a little bit more in the conversation because, with the housing affordability crisis that we're in Australia, it's pushing a lot of people out of the market. And there's a lot of potential homeowners that just can't get into the market that they want to get into. So, they may be forced into the rent vesting strategy to some degree. Well, look, what I wanted to do today was go through and do just a quick assessment of the pros and cons of rent vesting versus traditional home ownership. And then, like with anything, I've run a scenario and I've run some calculations, and I wanted to go through those calculations to show how it plays out based off my assessment of things. Now, before I get into it, I just want to declare I do have a bias here. I've always been an advocate of home ownership. I've always liked the idea of owning my own home, paying it off, making improvements to it over time. So that's very much the lens that I'm coming from. So I'm going to try and put that bias to the side and take an objective view here as best as I can. So let's look at the pros of rent vesting. So first of all, the loan interest and property expenses are tax deductible. That's a pretty big one. Second thing, rental income, you get rental income. So that helps you with the holding costs and it's passive income. That's a pretty good one. It's better cash flow. So in the short term, I think that's no surprise. I didn't really need to run the numbers too much to know that, if you pay rent and then you then buy an investment property, because you're getting the rental income and because the expenses are deductible, the cash flow is better on a short-term basis. Flexibility. So renting, it does allow you to move around, choose where you want to live, freedom to that degree to change locations. Rent vesting allows you to buy in a better investment location. So if it's outside of where you are, you can go and buy in a different location that has better growth prospects. And rent vesting allows you the ability to realize the equity. So you can sell the property at some point, choose to cash out your equity, take your gains, whereas home ownership, you can't do that. So the cons of rent vesting, well, rent that you pay for where you live is paid with after-tax money. Then also, big one, particularly in Victoria, land tax. So on investment properties, you're going to pay land tax. And that's quite insidious, as we'll come to see in these calculations that I do later. It really ramps up over time. The next one, big one, capital gains tax. So if you ever sell the property, of course, it's an investment, you've got to pay capital gains tax. Renting indefinitely. So I think this is a big one here, is that if you're renting and you're going down the rent vesting strategy and that's the permanent strategy for the rest of your life, rent will always be there and it's always going to continue to increase. If you rent, you have the potential to be evicted. So that's not a nice outcome. Tenancy laws have got a lot stricter around this and you can't just be booted out, on short notice. But, there is that potential that you can be evicted from the place that you live and you might be really enjoying living there. There's limitations around personalisation. So, you can make some small improvements to the property that you're renting, but, you can't really make major changes to it to suit your personal preferences. In terms of the lending, slightly higher interest rate. This isn't a big one, but slightly higher interest rate on investment loans as opposed to main residence or PPR loans. And then there's also a slightly higher interest rate if you're going to go on interest only, which a lot of people do for an investment property loan. Then there's also the potential that you could be locked out of the market indefinitely. So if your investments don't generate the same dollar value growth as a potential home, you might find yourself in a situation where you can never own a home in the location where you want to live, unless, of course, you sell all of your investments and pay a lot of capital gains tax on the way through. So let's look at home ownership now. So the pros of home ownership. First one from the top, the main residence CGT exemption. This is a big one. You don't get too many free kicks or tax-free outcomes in life, and it's a pretty big one, the main residence exemption. Living mortgage-free in retirement, I think that's also a really big one, which I'll come to show in these calculations that I've done. It's the mortgage doesn't go forever. And at some point, we'd hope, and for most of our clients, we'd hope to have the mortgage paid off and you're living rent-free, mortgage-free in retirement. There's more stability and security. So, you can't be evicted by the landlord. So you've got more stability knowing where you're going to be longer term, and no one's going to change that for you. Flexibility in terms of personalization. So as a homeowner, you can make changes to the property, you can do renovations, you can do improvements. Living the great Australian dream, I guess, it's a hallmark of financial security, and it's widely as an aspired goal in Australia is home ownership. So I guess it's living out that Australian dream. And then lower interest rates. The owner-occupier homes are typically lower in interest rates than investment property loans. So then the cons of home ownership, so non-deductible loan interest and expenses. It's pretty much the flip side of investment properties. Of course, all of the interest that you pay on your home loan, it's non-deductible, and so are the expenses for maintenance and those sorts of things. Less flexibility in the location. So, if you pick the home and you invest in it and that's where you're going to be, you can't really move around like a renter can. That's quite obvious. And I think it's mainly also the holding costs, the maintenance costs of home ownership. I think sometimes people just build it into their general living expenses, where I think with investment properties, people are really quite aware of the maintenance costs and they carve them out and they really measure them. But I think with home ownership, I sort of know that I don't really track every trip to Bunnings or a little bit of expenditure or maintenance that I do at the home, but I think there is quite a bit in your home, and I think you do more than you think in terms of home ownership and maintenance and improvements. Okay, so let's have a look at this case study, these two scenarios that I've mapped out. So let's take, for example, we have someone who's a 30-year-old and they're looking to buy a property, either their first home or an investment property. So this person, let's assume they have an income of 200,000. So they're 30 years old, income of 200,000. General living expenses of about 80,000 per year. They have cash savings of $200,000, and they've got a desired property that they'd like to live in or buy for $1 million. So this person can split down the two scenarios. So under the home ownership scenario, individual buys a property for $1 million, they pay a 20% deposit, and they borrow $800,000 from the bank. And they then take out a 30-year principal and interest mortgage, and let's assume over the course of 30 years, average it out at an interest rate of 5.75% over the course of the next 30 years. That's the traditional. That's a pretty common situation, buying the home and paying it off over 30 years. Alternatively, the person could go down the rent vesting scenario. So pretty much the same in that they'll put down a 20% deposit, borrow 800,000 from the bank. But the difference here is they'll go interest only on the loan, and the loan's a little bit higher. The interest rate, 6.25% average over the next 30 years. And let's assume they rent out that property for $480 per week, and then they also then go and rent out another property next door, for example, exactly the same one, for $480 per week. So let's assume both the rent that they pay and the rent they receive from their investment property increase by 4% annually, which is roughly what it's been over the last 10 years in Melbourne. So in both scenarios, the property experiences a capital growth rate of 7%. So let's, assume that it's a good property. It's getting 7% capital growth rate. And let's assume any surplus cash flow that this individual has after covering all their expenses goes straight towards investing in the share market with a return of 7% per annum. And we'll also assume that this person's an employee. So I've factored in, just their basic employer super contributions into super with a 7% return. And then for simplicity, I've disregarded any costs such as stamp duty, insurance, and maintenance because they're, similar across both scenarios. So I've just excluded them. But of course, I have included land tax and rental management fees for the rent vesting scenario. So under all of these assumptions, what are the results? So after 30 years at the point of retirement at age 60, person was 30, now 60, after 30 years, the rentvestor's net asset position is about $5.5 million in today's dollars, and the homeowner's net asset position is about $5.7 million in today's dollars. So the homeowner is slightly ahead by about $200,000. So not relatively pretty small difference. I was surprised by this. I thought that the rentvestor would be slightly ahead. And I guess, why is this? And it's basically land tax, slightly higher interest on the loan, and then the loan is on interest only. So the loan is there for the full period of time. So then the cumulative or accumulated interest on the loan is higher for the rentvestor as they haven't paid down the loan like the homeowner has. Now, it's important if we factor in the capital gains tax associated on the investment property for the rentvestor, because I know there'd be a lot of people saying, yeah, but what about if they sell it? What about the underlying unrealized capital gains that's associated with the investment property? Well, if we factor that in, at this point in time, the rentvestor's net asset position is about $4.8 million in today's dollars. So that makes the difference between the homeowner, the rent vestor's down by about $937,000. So look, putting the after capital gains tax position aside, really not much difference between the homeowner and the rent vestor. So pretty minuscule. But where we then look ahead into retirement, so let's look ahead at the next 30 years. So from the age of 60 to 90, and this is where there really becomes a big difference between the two. So obviously in retirement, the homeowner has paid off their mortgage over the 30-year period and they no longer have mortgage, whereas the rent vestor continues to have rent, which continues to go up, that expensive rent that continues to go up. Interestingly, the cash flow, the homeowner's cash flow in year one of retirement, so at 61 years old, is about $78,000 stronger than the rent vestors. Look, in both scenarios, they're fine. The projections work quite well and they'll both have a comfortable retirement. But, in comparing the two, the rent vestor has to sell down a little bit of the share portfolio that they've accumulated over the last 30 years, but not much. And then look, so the net asset positions are this. At the age of 90, the ripe age of 90, the homeowner's net asset position is $16.6 million in today's dollars, and the rent vestor's net asset position is about 14.6 in today's dollars. So that's a difference of about $1.9 million by the age of 90. So that really goes to show that's a much larger and substantial difference. And it really goes to show the benefit of the home ownership and living rent-free, mortgage-free in retirement. And then if we then factor in again the capital gains tax, which would be massive by that point after 60 years of holding the investment property, if we factor that into the rent vestor's net asset position, it puts them at about 11.6 million in today's dollars. So that's about 5 million less than the homeowner. So look, I think those numbers speak for themselves, but I think home ownership is not always the way. And I wanted to just mention a couple of instances where rent vesting makes sense. So one instance is if somebody is living in a suboptimal property market. So if you're living in an area that doesn't experience strong capital growth or it doesn't have strong capital growth prospects, then I don't think it makes sense ever to really buy an investment that's going to be a poor performer. So I think in that instance, it might make more sense to go and invest in property elsewhere and rent where they live. Also in instances where people have short-term living plans. So if you don't plan to stay in the specific area long term where you are at the moment, it might be that work takes you to a particular location. So if you're not planning on being in that location long term, then I think rent vesting could be a better avenue for you as well. And better to then buy the property in the location that you intend to land in eventually long term. Also for individuals that are interstate overseas, similar thing. If you're working in a different location, I don't think it makes sense to and again, it's going to be for the short term. I don't think it makes sense to buy and, have home ownership in that location if you're intending on moving later on. So look, typically we find when we're dealing with clients, the best thing to do is buy the forever home as soon as possible. That pretty much always works out to be the most advantageous thing to do. If you think about it, you have to buy the home with after-tax dollars. So delaying for 10 years, for example, could cost you an extra $1 million purchase price. And that's a lot of money on an after-tax basis. And in order to pay off that home, that would require your income to be substantially higher in order to afford that home. So we always like locking in that forever home as much as you can. Some people can't see that far into the future, but as much as you can, locking in that forever home as soon as possible in today's prices is very beneficial. So look, in conclusion, I think this analysis that I've done shows that there's not too much difference over the working career between a homeowner and a rent vestor, but really the big difference comes in retirement. So looking much further ahead, that's where I think the home ownership really puts an individual further in front in terms of a wealth creation strategy. But there's some instances where rent vesting might be the better approach, as I've just discussed. Right, I'm going to jump in and do a few listener questions now. So the first question comes from Ahmed. So Ahmed, I'm going to summarize things. He's provided a lot of information, but effectively Ahmed bought his house, which was a personal residence, in 2016. He then converted it to an investment property in 2017. And in 2013, he then demolished the home, completely demolished it and completely rebuilt the home. And he is then planning to move back into it. Construction's going to be finished soon, and he's going to move back into it for a year or two before potentially selling it. At which point, in a year or two, he estimates the market value of his home will be about $1.5 million. And really, his question is around if we live in the house, here's the question, if we live in the house for a year or two, declare it as a PPR and then sell it, can we benefit from the CGT exemption? Yes, and that's effectively, and then Ahmed's given a sort of a breakdown of timeline and values and all that sort of thing. But really, Ahmed, to answer the question at a high level, the CGT exemption and what you'll pay in terms of CGT is it's apportioned. So it's for the period of time. So if you map out the number of years of which you've owned the property, and then of that, the number of years of which it was rented out, those number of years, that percentage is what then gets applied to the total capital gains, and you do pay capital gains on that portion. So if it's 50% of the time that you've owned the property, it was rented out, you'd assess the total capital gains, and then 50% of that would be assessable. You'd get the additional 50% normal CGT discount like everyone does in that. But for the period, basically for the period of which it was rented out as a percentage, you pay capital gains tax on that. However, it is interesting. One thing I'll note for you is there's an exemption called the 6-year exemption rule. So I don't know, you haven't mentioned this in your information that you've sent through, but something for you to look into. In the roughly 6 years it was between 2017 to 2023, which you moved out and you rented out that property, if you didn't go and buy another home and live in it, so nominate a new main residence, if you were renting, for example, or living abroad or doing something else, you can claim a 6-year exemption rule, which allows you, as long as you haven't nominated another main residence, you can continue to claim that home that you previously lived in as your main residence for up to 6 years. So that'd pretty much tie over that 6-year period of which it was rented out, if that applies to you. So that's something that I would look into there, Ahmed. The next question is from MK. MK explains their situation. So they're a couple in their early to mid 40s with 3 primary school age kids. They own their home worth about 3 mil with a 1.1 mil mortgage, which is then fully offset. They've got 1.1 mil of cash in the offset account. They've got a portfolio, I'm guessing this is a share portfolio, of 450,000 in the lower earning spouse's name, and then another portfolio of 140,000 in the higher earning spouse's name, which is a mixture of ETFs and individual stocks. The household income, approximately 500,000 and 60,000. So I'm assuming that's the higher income earner is 500,000, lower income owner 60,000. Super balance of 700,000 and 150,000. MK then goes on to say, our approach to date has generally comprised of making monthly equity investments, additional concessional super contributions to the smaller balance, and additional repayments to the mortgage offset account. We've recently been more focused on offsetting the mortgage in the face of equity markets looking fully valued. We know this probably fits in the reasonable, not rational category. So then goes on to say, we're interested in whether you see our scenario as one where there is scope for a financial advisor to add value. We've kept it simple and low cost to date, relatively risk averse, and we're conscious our advisory team has been a mortgage broker and a lawyer. Maybe, MK. Yeah, I think on face value, it's looking like there might be value add there. And is there enough value add of which a financial advisor could add? I'd say maybe. Yeah, I'd think so. It's looking pretty good. You've got a strong position, so I think it'd be likely. The next question is, we see the next stage as either to acquire a high quality investment property, there's a window to borrow before private school fees commence, or to continue to scale our equity investments, possibly through a discretionary trust structure or mixing in some leveraging. Are we missing any other serious alternatives? And then they go on to say, if we go down the investment property route, any tips on how to find a great buyer's agent? So look, on that point, Stuart recorded a podcast recently, we did in fact, on the hallmarks of a good buyer's agent and questions to ask and things that you should go through in your vetting process in order to identify a quality buyer's agent for you to work with. To look back to your original question, in terms of whether you should acquire a high quality investment property, on face value, I think you probably should. Yeah, I mean, the mortgage is completely paid off, early mid to 40s, high income, family income's 560,000. You've already built up a decent equity portfolio of what's that, roughly 600,000. Super balances are in good order. I feel like, yeah, I mean, my guess, at face value is that I think, yeah, that you should get some leveraging in there and buy an investment property. I think you'd have good borrowing capacity. Again, I don't know what your general living expenses are, so I don't know how much capacity you have for the holding costs of an investment property, but at a high level at face value, I think I probably would. I think you're in a good position to do so. So MK, if you look at the podcast and blog, which was released on the 26th of February, is actually one that I did. I couldn't even quite remember it. That's where we discuss how to make the hallmark of a great buyer's agent and what to look for in that vetting process. So I go and have a listen to that podcast and that should help you. I hope that helps. The next question is from Dennis. So, Dennis first says, I've been consistently listening to the podcast since 2024 and I find it really engaging and useful. We own our home in North Rocks in New South Wales and an investment property in Stafford Heights in Queensland. So, the home's worth 1.9 mil with a 1.1 mil mortgage against it. The investment property is worth about 1 mil with a $480,000 loan against it. Been a few maintenance issues, but otherwise it's doing quite well. Dennis sort of then goes on to just explain the monthly mortgage repayments, the investment property mortgage repayments, the rental income, car repayments, all that sort of thing. I'll sort of cover off over that. They're both in their late 30s. We have 2 toddlers in daycare and monthly fees, which are being subsidised. 1 toddler's going to school next year, so that will help. He mentions my monthly take-home salary is about 6.5 grand, and my wife was recently made redundant, and we're unable to make ends meet. We just made ends meet when we had 2 incomes, but basically, summarising things here, they're going a little bit backwards. They're down to 1 income, and the wife is going to start her own business, and hopefully it'll take off within the next 6 months. Dennis mentions so they've got 30,000 in the offset account and 100,000 in stocks that we're willing to sell if absolutely necessary. He says, based on our estimations, 130,000 will last us for another 12 to 15 months, and hopefully my wife's business will start making money in the next 6 months. So my question is, would you advise us to sell the Brisbane investment property to reduce the mortgage on our home? We're conflicted in selling the investment property because we think it will continue to do well. We're reluctant to give up on future potential capital gains since we have the cash buffer to ride us out for a while. We'd like to invest further when the cash flow allows. We'd appreciate your opinion and your thoughts. Yeah, I agree with you, Dennis. I'd hold in there. I'd be really reluctant to sell. Look, if assuming that property of yours in Brisbane is good quality and you've kind of indicated that it has, and it's got investment grade attributes to it, I'd be really reluctant to sell it. I'd use, if you're going to have to go backwards a little bit in terms of using the cash in offset, maybe selling down the share portfolio. Yeah, Brisbane's going through such an amazing growth cycle at the moment. And if that property is a good quality property, just be a real shame to sell it. And so, let alone, the expenses and costs of selling the property. So I think, yeah, hang in there. And I think use the cash that you can. Sort of, it's going to get a bit tight, but I think you hope that your wife's business is going to start to do well. Maybe there'll be some interest rate cuts and, cost of living relief potentially that comes in. So I agree with you, Dennis. I'd try and hold in there. Make sure you don't hold in there too late, though. Keep in mind, if it comes to the point where you think you're going to have to sell the investment property, allow yourself, 6 months at least to do it, because by the time tenants are moved out, improvements, sale campaign, all that sort of thing, I think properties sell quicker in Brisbane. They don't have the same sale campaign as they do in Melbourne, but allow yourself plenty of time there is the instance. Don't leave it to the very last minute. But I agree with you. I'd be very reluctant to sell that property if it's good, and I'd say just hold in there. I hope that helps. I've probably got time for one more question now. So the final question is from Kyle, who's in Perth. He explains his situation. I'm 35, my wife's 32, 3 kids, 7, 4, and 0. Current financial position, no debt. They own the home worth 1.4 mil in Perth, about 165,000 in his super, 65,000 in his wife's, about 20,000 in index funds, about 75,000 in high yielding savings account. His income is 175 to 200,000 depending on bonuses. Wife's income part-time is about 40,000. So their annual savings rate is about $80,000. Kyle writes, we're looking to buy an investment property in the near future, and I was thinking of buying a house in Melbourne as I don't want to buy in Perth due to Perth property sensitivities to the performance of the mining sector. I've owned a home here for 15 years and barely seen any capital growth for the first 12. Yeah, long haul there. Other than buying the Melbourne property with max leverage in my name to minimise tax, we were planning on putting future savings into index funds either in my wife's name or through a trust. I don't want to overly allocate to superannuation, even though I know the tax benefits. I work a pretty physically demanding and high-stress job. I couldn't think of anything worse than waiting until 60 to retire and access those super funds. My plan is to hold the Melbourne property for at least a decade until I leave my work for something lower paid, casual, and then sell that property to invest the capital gains into a high yielding investment such as index funds, ETFs, dividend stocks. I could then use the dividend yield to supplement my income. What are your thoughts on this plan and changes you would make to increase our asset pool over the next decade? So, Kyle, all of what you said, pretty good. I think I'd agree with all of it on face value. You have no debt now. Assuming that that annual rate of saving of 80,000 is right, I think there is probably scope to buy an investment property. I think it's wise to buy it out of where you are living at the moment into a different geographical location, and buying it in Melbourne, I think, is a good idea. How much you buy for, I'm not quite sure. Again, it sort of depends on a little bit limited by your serviceability and how much you should borrow. But, at a high level, I like that. I like then investing then the rest of your surplus cash flow into more liquid assets. Probably don't agree with you on the super front. Sorry, Kyle. I think, you've got to keep that ticking along, but your employer contributions will be, contributing to it. So yeah, I think you sort of disregard super at your peril. But anyways, I won't convince you there. But otherwise, I think it's okay. But the issue I have with is, this really set time frame of, buy the investment property in Melbourne, hold it for 10 years, then sell it when you resign or step down into a less intensive role. Having that sort of strict time frame of thinking you're going to get those returns in 10 years, you're going to bank your whatever percent capital growth over that 10 years. I mean, it's risky. I mean, we'd never really map out a situation like that for clients. We'd like to map out a situation and where hopefully the clients never have to sell anything, but they can if need be. And it's okay sometimes if we map out a scenario for holding an investment property for a set period of time. But yeah, I don't know, I'm just a bit risky in it. If you leave yourself in a situation in 10 years where you then want to wind back your working commitments and drop your income, and you have to sell, and that's the plan, and then you really have to sell the property in order for that to work, then what happens if the Melbourne property market doesn't do what we think it does? There's a bit of risk in that. It's a short period of time. And as you say, you've been in Perth for owning that home for 12 years where you saw nothing happen. And it's only in the last 3 years that you saw something happen. So timing risk and market risk could come into play there. So I think you try and position yourself in your planning so that you don't have to sell that property straight away in 10 years to wind back your work. Hopefully, the cash flow demands of that property have improved over 10 years. The rent goes up, interest rates come down. Maybe you've paid off a little bit of that debt. So you've got it, it's not as much of a burden on your cash flow. But I don't know if I like just the, very black and white sort of selling it in 10 years and then taking all the equity out and that sort of thing. So that's probably the only change I'd make to it. Otherwise, I think you're doing pretty well. I'd sort of think, keep super ticking along, Kyle. But otherwise, I think your thinking's pretty good there. I hope that helps. So that's all I've got time for today. So until next time, bye for now.
Just a few things before we wrap up, if I may. Of course, you can send me questions at investopoly.com.au. But for a quicker response, feel free to add a comment on the episode's video over on YouTube. We have an Investopoly YouTube channel and the link is in the show notes. I'm incredibly grateful for the 4.9 star rating on Apple with over 400 reviews. Thank you so much. If you can leave a review or rating, I'd love it because I'd love to get over 1,000 reviews. That's kind of my target. Keep checking the show notes for free downloads, and I include book discounts there as well. And of course, if you're interested in working with my team and I've included a web link where you can find out a little bit more about what we do and get in touch with us. And of course, until next time, bye for now.